Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Chitheads. My guest today is Jeffrey Lidke. Jeffrey is chair of the Department of Religion and Philosophy at Berry College in Rome, Georgia. A graduate of the doctoral program at the University of California, Santa Barbara, Dr. Lidke's primary research interests include Tantrism, Indian aesthetics, and the neuroscience of contemplative practice. His publications include Vishvarupa Mandir, a study of Changu Narayan, Nepal's most ancient temple, and the forthcoming Beyond and Within the Three Cities, Shakta Tantra and the Paradox of Power and Nepala Mandala, in addition to a number of reviews, chapters, and articles. Jeffrey's study of South Asian religions has included extensive field research in India, Nepal, Bali, and Bhutan, as well as personal training in music, tabla, meditation, martial arts, and yoga. So hello, Jeffrey. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Hello, Jacob. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So before we get started talking about your new book, which has yet to be released, is that correct?
No, actually, my bio needs to be revised. So it was released in early January. It is on the market.
Oh, excellent. Great. So we're going to talk about that, a little bit about that in a moment, because I really enjoyed reading that book. But before we get started, I'd love to hear a little bit about your story, your own personal story of how you came to study these practices, these traditions, and a little bit about that whole trajectory.
Great. Thank you for that interest. It's a great question. The primary influence really comes from my parents. I was born into a household and just a life circumstance where my parents were very interested in various religious and spiritual paths. And by the time I was 5, they were deeply immersed in the study of yoga and meditation, meeting such established teachers from India as Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, later the Dalai Lama, the Karmapa, and Swami Muktananda. And so I was brought to a number of formal ceremonies. I was even initiated into a mantra tradition at age 5. I received Shaktipat from Muktananda at age 10. And that same year, I received the black hat ceremony from the Karmapa. And I've always looked at that year in my life, that was 1978, and they both came to the Bay Area, as really, they were literally planting seeds for the unfolding of my life, my professional career. Both of them represent tantric traditions. Muktananda's coming from the Hindu Shakta and Shaiva tantric tradition, and then the Karmapa is a Kagyu Tibetan Buddhist tantric master. And I received those initiations, and then I went through a somewhat standard teendom, right? Junior high through high school. I was just mostly interested in sports and girls and things like that. And at age 16, I had a very powerful and unexpected meditative spiritual experience, actually on the holy night of Shivaratri, that really opened my eyes to the validity of the traditions that my parents had introduced me to, but in which I really didn't have any personal interest to that point. And from that point on, I got very interested in not only meditation practice, but also particularly the philosophical systems associated with them. And after I graduated high school, went on to pursue a BA at the University of Colorado at Boulder, I didn't realize until the first orientation session that actually religious studies was an academic discipline that I could get my degree in. And that literally, or it seemed to me that a bell went off, and it was very clear to me that, oh, this is my course. And I really knew from that point, I was 18, that I was going to pursue a PhD in religious studies, particularly focusing on Asian traditions, and then I would teach and write about it. And that's how my courses unfolded. As a junior at the University of Colorado at Boulder, I was a member, transferred for 1 year to the University of Wisconsin-Madison to do their college year in Nepal program. Spent a year in the Kathmandu Valley area, traveled also to India and later to Bali. came back the next year on the Naropa University program, then went on to pursue my master's and PhD at Santa Barbara. And in 1996, I was a Fulbright dissertation fellow, and that gave me a full year of funding to return to the Valley and continue my studies. With my first visit to Nepal, I wrote my first book, Vishwarupa Mandir, which is a study of an ancient pagoda named Changu Narayan. And then with my dissertation study, that resulted in many years later. That was 1996. My book took 20 years to come out. That's this current book, The Goddess Within and Beyond the Three Cities. It was during that time also that I began my study of tabla, which has always been a very important part of my own meditative practice. I went to Muktananda's ashram in Ganeshpuri multiple times, and then also met a number of teachers in Nepal, particularly Stanishwar Timosina, whose voice is a very important one in this latest book of mine, as he is not only a really internationally renowned scholar of Sanskrit and Indian philosophical and religious traditions, but also an initiated guru within the Sarva Amnaya tradition of tantric Hindu tantrism that the book is based on. So
where does he teach now?
San Diego State University.
Okay. He's
professor of Indology there.
Excellent. So your path starts, as you mentioned, from the perspective of a practitioner. Among other traditions, you were involved with, the Siddha Yoga lineage, as you mentioned. You were initiated, or you received Shaktipat from Muktananda. So, at what point did this become a more scholarly interest? Was that always kind of there? And then I'm interested to hear how, in this new wave, it's becoming more normal, of course, to hear about scholar practitioners, and how I discovered your work was actually through, Sutra Journal, which established itself as a platform for work by scholar practitioners. And I'm just interested to hear how this dynamic, or this kind of dual role of scholar and practitioner, has played out in your life. Have you encountered any conflicts in that kind of in that mode, or has it always been relatively complementary?
No, I've definitely experienced conflicts. They've ultimately been conflicts that have, I think, resulted in some really important understanding. I see my path as a scholar and a practitioner, is completely intertwined. And of course, this isn't unusual. I mean, the whole idea of Christian theology is that you're a faith-based scholar, and your faith drives your scholarship and vice versa. But there is a kind of naive approach to faith-based scholarship that I think has to be shattered. I think you have to go through a kind of Dark Knight-esque questioning of everything that you understood to be the case as you really move forward in your understanding of what it means to be a faith-based scholar. And I definitely had that experience under the tutelage of Gerald James Larson at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I definitely came into that program of very much an insider's perspective, a sense that because I'm an initiate, and at that time I was a disciple of Guru Mai Chidvilasananda, who was one of two successors to Muktananda, and just really did think, I know I've got this. And Larson had great respect for my immersion in the tradition, but also could clearly see the degree to which I was really wearing kind of interpretive blinders and seeing things really only from one perspective. And we had an encounter which really forced me to call into question my faith. In a sense, I lost my faith, but then I came back to it and realized that I could balance the insiders with the outsiders' perspective. I could be more critical. I could engage. At the time, Foucault's post-structuralist philosophy was in vogue, and I dove into that and thought through that lens. And in a lot of ways, my book reflects that attempt to balance the insider and the critical outsider's perspective. And that's really been an ongoing process for me. I would like to think that I do have faith, but it's a faith that's been nuanced and in a lot of ways, to put it simply, my journey really began. I was a theist grounded in Hindu traditions, and now I'm a non-theist grounded in Buddhist traditions.
Okay.
But at the same time, the non-dualism of Trikakala Tantra was a bridge for me between Hindu theism and Buddhist non-theism. And really, as I've looked at the Trikakala traditions and then, the sophisticated Dzogchen and other traditions of Buddhism, it seems to me ultimately they come to the same place.
Right. So that's very interesting. So I want to go back just a little bit to you're talking about being a disciple of Guru Mai, and my own understanding of the Siddha Yoga lineage, at least, is that there's an emphasis on the I guess male representation of divinity in the form of Shiva. But your recent book, and so we'll kind of use this as a segue into talking about it, The Goddess Beyond and Within the Three Cities, is focused, almost exclusively on a goddess-centered tradition, a Shakti-centered tradition. So, what moved you in that direction, and was that a part of your own journey toward this kind of non-theistic Buddhist lineage that you're participating in now, or was this just merely a scholarly interest?
There is a perspective from which I see my scholarship and my life journey kind of unfolding at once, kind of systematically and logically, and then also somewhat organically.
Mm-hmm.
Within the Siddha Yoga tradition, there is the focus on Shiva, but there's also the focus on the goddess, and particularly Kundalini Shakti.
Right.
And within the tantric traditions themselves, from which Muktananda drew the inspiration for his creation, Siddha Yoga, his masterpiece, grounded authentically in all sorts of traditions, Shaivite and Shakta, God-centered and goddess-centered. And in reality, historically, the Shaiva lineages and the Shakta lineages were exactly that, historical lineages of teachers and students receiving initiations based in texts from teachers. And the Shaiva texts would focus on Shiva and include Shiva-centered mantras, mystical sounds and diagrams, etc. And then the Shakta lineage is the same story, guru and disciples, receiving this wisdom. But tremendous overlap across those lineages, and then also lineages like Trikakala, which say, okay, here's the Shiva lineage, here's the Shakta lineage. Well, Shiva and Shakti, they're just manifestations of one ultimate reality. We embody all of those. We give the initiation for all of those. And so within that kind of Kaula context, the pursuit of Shaivite wisdom and the pursuit of Shakta wisdom, it's really the same pursuit.
So that's a specific, because that's sort of been my understanding, is that, Shiva and Shakti transcend kind of a more, crude sort of gender binary, that we're talking about forces or qualities. We're not talking about, a kind of gendered absolute in that sort of way. But are you saying that even that more esoteric understanding is the idea of a particular lineage stream?
In Trikakala, yes.
Okay.
Right.
So there are other traditions in which the Shiva and Shakti are considered more to be gendered?
Oh, that Trikakala considers them in it. No, right. No, I would just say, when you look at Hinduism as a whole, right, you're talking about, 1.2 billion people spread out across the world, centered in India, with a very long history, and it's really a massive set of traditions and ideas about this, that, and the other. As you explore the spectrum of Hinduism on the ground, as it were, you do encounter people, that are just Hindus living their lives that really aren't that fussed about, Shiva is a male god and Shakti is a female goddess and they're gendered, and what's the problem? I'm worshiping them. But, and I think, of course, we see that in the West too, right? Literalist interpretations and God is male, et cetera, and so forth. But definitely in the more esoteric, abstract systems of Tantra, all of that dissolves. It becomes symbolic. I mean, of course, there is the gender of Shiva in men like you and me, and there is the gender of Shakti in women, but all men and all women contain Shiva and Shakti within themselves, and that becomes more and more subtle as you start talking about Shiva as a witnessing consciousness, and Shakti is that dynamic energy which manifests before that consciousness as the embodied universe.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Did I get?
Oh, yeah, definitely. That was a really beautiful description. So now to your book, The Goddess Beyond and Within the Three Cities, let's just get very specific here. So who is the goddess of this text, and what are the three cities, and what is their significance?
Right. Well, it's again a very multi-level answer. I'll just start.
Yeah, you wrote a whole book about it, so it would have to be.
So I try to respect the spectrum of meanings and not let the esoteric, more abstract, symbolic override the historically grounded literalist.
Right.
But starting from the literalist, the historical, the goddess of my book is Tripura Sundari, the beautiful one who is beyond and within the three cities. And this is a form of Parvati who is intimately linked with her consort Shiva in historical traditions. And there are wonderful narratives about her. And she's looks a bit like the goddess Lakshmi in her anthropomorphic depiction. She wears beautiful, typically red and gold garments, right? And she has a crown, and she's lovely, and she has 4 arms, and she has symbols in those arms, etc., and so forth. And she was the goddess for a particular lineage known as Sri Vidya, which was a very important Shakta or goddess-centered tantric lineage that had manifestations, instantiations in the north, in Kashmir, and also in the South India, and then also in Nepal. And scholars debate where she originated. Naturally, the folks of the respective regions are going to, argue their case, and scholars, have their arguments. A lot of stuff certainly originates in the Himalayas when it comes to India and the subcontinent. Of course, Nepal is smack dab in the Himalayas, where you have Mount Everest. And so it's a study of that historical tradition and really the symbolism of the goddess, most particularly as she's represented by what's called her Para Rupa, her supreme symbol, which is as the Sri Chakra Yantra. Now, as we dive into that tradition, the understanding of what that goddess is becomes very rich. And in my study, I try to take into account, well, how does, the street cleaner on the streets of Bhaktapur in Kathmandu understand this goddess? How does a musician understand her? How does the artist who paints her understand her? How does a child understand her? And go all the way to some of the most sophisticated esoteric texts which exist in abundance in Nepal, in the homes of practitioners, and also the National Archives. And most particularly, I focused on a 9th century scripture called the Nitya Shodashi Karnava, which means the ocean of the eternal 16. And it's really a liturgical prayer to this goddess, Tripura Sundari, and it includes important commentaries by Shivananda and Vidyananda, who were both initiates in the Trikakala lineage of Abhinavagupta, and they provide this very rich Trikakala non-dualist understanding of who that goddess is. And I argue that interpretation kind of is at the upper spectrum of interpretive kind of sophistication. It doesn't exclude the other interpretations, and really what I try to do is tackle them all. And I would say at the most refined mystical level, the question, who is the goddess you're writing about? Who is that? The answer would be, from within the tradition of Abhinavagupta, she is your own deepest sense of self. That experience of self that you're having now, the I consciousness, that is the goddess. Right? And so the tradition is fundamentally about making people self-aware. And right, and so that is that is the spectrum of interpretations. And as far as her name goes, so Tripura Sundari, Sundari means beautiful. Tripura is the three cities in one interpretation. And in that interpretation, the three cities really refers to all of the triads that comprise the created world, whether it's the functions of creation, destruction, and dissolution that are ongoing, whether it is the three phases of time, past, present, and future, whether it is the three angles of the mystical trigram. It's all, the idea is creation, and she is creation. She's the goddess of creation, the three cities. But you can also render Tripura etymologically such that the long A on Pura means prior to or previous. And so the meaning here is she's the goddess who is beyond the three cities. In other words, she is the source and cause and embodiment of creation, but she's also prior to it and beyond it. And that basic understanding of a goddess who is within creation and also prior to and beyond it really lays at the heart of what my thesis is in terms of trying to understand this tradition in terms of its message about what it means to be embodied and living in the world, and then also the possibility of experiencing a kind of transcendence to this world, because this world can be a trap. It can be a cause of delusion, and obviously all things embodied die. Right? So this is, as with all Indian yogic traditions, this is a tradition that seeks and promises immortality.
Beautiful. So does this triad of the three cities, does this also extend to, I'm thinking of Paul Muller-Ortega's, triadic heart of Shiva, where we have this split between the knower, the knowing, and the known. Is that so?
Absolutely.
So any kind of triadic expression, right, that you find okay.
Exactly. Yeah, on a real fundamental level, because then also those three correspond to mystical syllables, and then that leads you into your yogic and mantric and ritual practice. And yes, all of those meanings of the triad that Paul unpacks are understood and assumed by Shivananda and Vidyananda. And as they analyze this goddess, this is the meaning that they're yoking.
So, when we think of a triad, we think of a triangle, and that sort of then points to this geometrical symbol, the Sri Yantra, which you talk about and which is fundamental to this tradition. Can you talk a little bit about, well, first of all, what is the difference between a yantra and a mandala? This is a question that people ask all the time. Is there a difference, or is it just two words for essentially the same thing? So that's my first question. And then the second is, what is the importance of sacred geometry? Like, how does this come to become such play such a crucial role in the kind of ritual life of this tradition?
Okay, yeah, those are excellent questions. And the question is, are yantras and mandalas pretty much the same thing? It's not at all a dumb question. And to some degree, yes, both yantras and mandalas are paintings or representations of sacred spaces. But it is important to understand that the word yantra literally means tool. And yantras are specifically tools for meditative practice.
Okay.
And typically, almost always, they are aniconic. They're geometrical structures. Mandala literally means map, suggesting territory. And mandalas are precisely that. They can present geographical territories or celestial, heavenly territories, or the territory associated with a saint, a Buddha, or some other, heavenly figure. What gets confusing is there are contexts in which mandalas are used for meditation and ritual. And in those contexts, they do have a kind of tool-like function. Right, but they're also they can be just precisely that, representations of sacred space. They can adorn temples and monasteries, and not solely just be used in meditative practice, but that when a yantra is really for the purpose of ritual meditative practice.
Okay, so let's now move a little bit into a tradition that you talk about a lot in your book, which the Sarva Amnaya, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Correct.
Okay, good. So, this was a really beautiful system that you described for a number of different reasons, but, and I was surprised to hear, in your book you mentioned that it's been very little studied. And so I'd love for you to talk a little bit about it, what's unique about it and what the significance is, of it, laid down next to the whole kind of, or the many variants of Shaiva Shakta traditions.
Yeah, excellent. So really the world's foremost scholar on the Sarvamnaya is Mark Lichkowski. And he prefers the term Shud Amnaya. Okay. Amnaya means stream or transmission. So the transmission of the six, which is a meaning that's associated with the six faces of Shiva's Shiva Linga, the symbol that represents Shiva and has four faces in the cardinal directions, and then one upper face and one so-called lower face, all associated with these transmissions, which refers to scriptural revelations. And with all scriptural revelations in Tantra, they are simultaneously theologies, mythologies, liturgical practices, and meditative systems, all in one. And so the idea then is that when you talk about a Shud Amnaya system or Sarva Amnaya, as Stanishwar Timal Sina preferred to use, really meaning the same system, meaning all of those transmissions, all six of them, Sarva Amnaya. When you get a system like that, and you have it in Nepal, it was clearly in Kashmir, we see it in other places in India, what you have is you have someone like an Abhinavagupta whose knowledge of tantric literature is so vast, so profound, so all-comprehensive. He has the ability to systematize it, to bring it all together, and the brilliance to say all of that revelation, which happened all over, it happened in the north, it happened in the south, it happened in the west, it happened in the east. Some came from above, some came from below. All of that, it's a part of the one cosmic revelation of the one divine reality, which you can call Paramashiva or you can call Devi, other names. And the thing is, someone like Abhinavagupta, and this translates into what we see into the Nepalese tradition, the argument is, and it's all interrelated. It's not independent systems of revelation. It's really meant to be interrelated. It's all these mantras, it's all these practices, and you're supposed to do them all systematically and in order by someone who can show you the sequence of initiations and take you through the process. And the reason that you're supposed to do this, and you can see how this connects to the Muktananda lineage in terms of similar patterns of practice. What was being argued by Abhinavagupta and Sarva Amnaya adepts like Stanishwar Timal Sina is that there's a very real spiritual, physical, emotional transformation that happens as you receive these initiations. And that process of transformation is grounded in the awakening of the Kundalini Shakti. And they're taking you through the process of bringing that Kundalini Shakti to its final resting place in the crown of the head.
Yeah, and one thing that was, I thought, very interesting about that is you mentioned that there are six kind of streams of revelation or initiation, and those are mapped onto the six chakras, which I'm sure, contemporary practitioners would love to hear about this, because it seems that in this system is the kind of, I don't know if it's right to say original, but one of the kind of traditional kind of systematic uses of this system. So I'd love for you to talk about that a little bit. Is this where we originally find the chakras, or are the chakras actually earlier than this? Do we see them, and this is sort of a new kind of transformation or appropriation of the chakras?
So when you say, do we find them, do you mean this particular interpretation of which goddesses and which mantras, or just
Well, I mean, so oftentimes we hear that the chakras, are originated with the tantric tradition, but I'm just curious if this is where we find them, or if this was something that was pre-existing.
No, I don't think so. I think I think one of your teachers, right, Harish Wallace, has done a blog and maybe an article. Definitely, he's published a very nice piece on, that we get information about the chakras from a number of different texts and historical contexts in India. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the very important sources is medical, right? Yeah. It's medical traditions trying to understand what's going on in the body, the flow of breath and blood, but the idea of also the body of an energetic system. So nadis and chakras come up in those contexts. And Tantra really, because Tantra was all about systematizing all the systems of knowledge. Tantra wasn't supposed to contradict anything. It was supposed to say, well, given what the doctors are saying, and given what the musicians are experiencing, given what the politicians want and you want, this is what connects it all together. So
I see.
Chakra, understanding of the subtle physiology, it predates Tantra. Tantra is claiming to be a science, right?
Right.
Fundamentally, and it's a science that's grounded on the idea of the logic or the wisdom of the body, the Deha Vidya. So the tantrics were very, they were happy with, okay, yeah, this brilliant medical stuff, we're going to take this, but they definitely embellished it. They added to it. Different tantric traditions have different understandings of which goddesses are where and which mantras should be associated with different chakras, different numbers of chakras. And that's where I think Harish in his article was trying to walk a delicate line, one that I really respected, and say, look, I'm not saying this stuff is made up, but there is a kind of, level, I don't want to quote him, but I would put it, a kind of interpretive creativity within these different traditions that suggests that it's not that they're saying it's not literal, mm-hmm. but what they're saying is, it's beyond. We're talking about energy. We're talking about consciousness, and what we're trying to say is, if you engage in meditative, mantric practices, you can do profound things to your energetic being. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right? I think of it kind of musically, like our 7 chakras are like these places that can resound. Right? We can create this internal ensemble of right.
I love that. Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful, and that ties in really beautifully with what we can talk about in a little bit, which is you sort of end on a musical note in your book and the importance of music, which I thought was really beautiful. And just to continue in this kind of chakra vein, because I think it's kind of interesting. So, what you're noting and what I think is why I find these traditions so captivating is that the tantrics they seem to have been such master systematizers, and they created systems in such a way that the internal logic of the system just made so much sense, even on an intuitive level. They really were able to kind of take all of these diverse kind of conceptual vocabularies and tie them into some kind of beautiful kind of conceptual aesthetic. But when in your book, you mentioned that the Muladhara, it's like that in this tradition, the meditation upon the Muladhara will bring a kind of material wealth, which is very similar to what the kind of Western psychological appropriation has been of the Muladhara chakra, where the Muladhara chakra is often associated with kind of, financial stability and, stability on all levels, like sense of grounding. So how far, I'm not sure, how much you're privy to the kind of modern psychological understanding, but how far can we take this, this complementarity between what the Sarvamnaya system seems to be saying about what's associated, psychologically or psychophysically with these, different levels of the chakra system, with what has sort of been handed down into the popular vocabulary of the chakras. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a deep question, and then you got people like Carl Jung, obviously, and many others kind of involved in the historical process of translating the chakra system into Western currency, right?
Yeah.
Um, I think as a really basic place to begin, we have to remember that Tantra, among its other claims, is bringing to the initiate not just moksha or spiritual freedom and transcendence of the suffering inherent with embodied existence, but also boga, the enjoyment of embodiment. And within that context of bringing the enjoyment of embodiment, the goddess as Lakshmi, and the goddess of the Muladhara in the Sarvamnaya tradition is Hatakeshi, the golden goddess, effectively, and that's Lakshmi. And so she's really embodies that idea that there is a kind of living here on earth where you have the material goods you need to live, a satisfying, content life, and that's there is a kind of blessing in that. It's not the only path. The path of the ascetic, the path of poverty can also, of course, be noble, but it is a legitimate path, and in that context, I think tantrics take very seriously, like, yes, this mantra, this ritual, this mandala, you do, or yantra really, you do this practice, and it will generate the power to give you physical abundance and enjoyment of physical existence. And for some, that's, we can judge them and say, well, because they're shallow-minded or they didn't complete the process. Some, that's all they're looking for,
yeah.
right? But someone like Stanishwar Timosina, who at once is a top-tier scholar, and by the way, check out his Tantric Visual Culture, published by Routledge, and wonderful for addressing this question about the multi-levels of chakra systems and what it all means, and he gets into just really rich Western metaphor theory, and he'd be a great interview.
Okay. What was the name of that text? Tantric Visual Culture?
Tantric Visual Culture, and it's by Stanishwar Timosina.
Okay.
So continuing with that question, what someone like Stanishwar would say is, you got to keep moving, and so, there is that, the enjoyment of the embodied, that's great, but the greatest enjoyment of the body actually is literally the bliss, the Ananda Shakti that arises within the being of the practitioner who's engaged in the highest states of meditative practice. And when that bliss arises, you do not need anything, right? It is its own fulfillment. It is the nectar of immortality actually being released through the completion of the rise of Kundalini Shakti. And so that's also then the point where enjoyment of the world becomes transcendence of the world, and of course vice versa.
So now, we're talking about this rich tradition, and when I was reading your book, I found it so profoundly beautiful, and it made me immediately want to go to Nepal and kind of pilgrimage to these sites that you're talking about. And so I'm kind of wondering, and you spent time there as well, what were you ever a practitioner of these traditions? I mean, what given this the beautiful kind of fecundity and of this tradition, how did you end up moving away from it to something, more, I don't know. I know that there's a diverse range of Buddhist traditions, but I always think of my general kind of thought about the Buddhist traditions as they're less flowerful, whereas this is such a flowerful tradition.
Yeah, good question. Well, they are flowerful, and the flowerful traditions are Baroque. They're complex, right? Mm-hmm. And it's I got into these mantra practices and the yantra visualizations. It was great. I did these different 108,000 repetitions. It took however many japa turns, and but Abhinavagupta has a system that Swami Muktananda kind of adopted, and it was this idea of the upayas, the paths, spiritual fulfillment, and there's 4 of them, and it's kind of debated whether or not they're supposed to be progressive, etc. I've published a couple pieces that suggest they are progressive. I take that interpretation, and at least they can be, and the first stage is where you're really grounded in yogic practices, kind of got an ascetic mindset. You're turning inward. You're learning to cultivate your inner cognitive powers and also control your senses so you can start to refine them and enable your senses not to just to relish what's outside of us, but also what's inside of us. And then in the next stage, you move into the use of mantra, the Shakta Upaya. And then in the Shambhava, the third stage, you're moving towards a stage where they talk about the idea of the use of the will. And there's kind of less reliance on ritual procedures and breath control and so forth. And then the final stage is the Anupaya, literally the non-path, where it's the idea is, well, if the goal of this practice is to recognize that the deity you seek is your own inner self vibrating, right? That self-awareness, then at least in theory, anything and everything you do is an expression and experience of that. And I would think in my own case, and I want to be careful here because I'm not trying to claim at all that, I'm some kind of master and, therefore I don't need practice, because that's not true. I don't believe that at all. And I'm not sure the journey ever ends. And I'm definitely very wary, having myself seen how gurus rise and fall, that you have to be very careful about claiming to be anything, even if it's true. And in my case, I know it's not. I'm just an ordinary human being. But I do think what happened to me is that, when I had my Shaktipat awakening at age 10 on the eve of Shivaratri, I dove in. I mean, I suddenly became this high school junior I was kind of failing out of school. I suddenly was waking up 5:36 to chant the Guru Gita and other chants and meditate.
As a junior in high school?
As a junior in high school.
Wow, that's amazing.
I lost friends. I lost a really sweetheart girl, and they were just like, you've gone out of your mind.
Wow.
But it's what I wanted to do, and I kind of maintained that real strong focus for about 14 years, and that extended through my research in Nepal for my dissertation. And then, gradually I kind of just naturally let a lot of that go and shifted to what I felt was more important, which was trying to maintain in all moments that awareness that self that looks through me is the deity I'm seeking. And in Buddhism, I found, I met teachers and also found practices that really informed that idea, whether it was in Zen Buddhist traditions or Dzogchen or others. And, I've never seen a conflict at all.
Yeah.
Sri Yantra is still the centerpiece of my house. I have Hindu deities all over the place. And so, when people ask me, what are you? I tend to say I'm Buddhist. It's kind of easy as people have less misconceptions about what that might mean. But really, I'm an initiate of both the Trikakala tradition, which I see is absolutely connected to the Sarvamnaya and includes Muktananda, and then also the Tibetan Buddhist traditions, and really just they're both consistent. Hinduism can be very flowery, Tibetan Buddhism can be
Tibetan
very flowery,
Buddhism.
very simplified, and it's just there for you. And I think you have to trust your natural predilection in the moment, and find what it is that you need to ingest, metaphorically, in order to be fed spiritually.
Oh, that's beautiful. So, I like what you're describing is the idea that they're not in conflict, and I think that's sort of the spirit of embodied philosophy is try to share, literature and educational experiences about these traditions, but not in a way that respects and honors the lineage streams, but also allows one to see that they're not, I don't know what the maybe correct word is, or that there's something ontologically separated about them, or that, they have some kind of fundamental conflict that wouldn't allow one to kind of reside within the kind of milieu of one and the other. So, when you encounter moments where where maybe the map of one tradition conflicts with another, and maybe you don't experience this. Maybe that's what you're saying. What do you sort of appeal to? Is it just kind of the Buddhist tradition that you're currently entrenched in? I don't know. I can't really give an example, and so maybe there isn't one. But do you understand essentially what I'm asking? Okay.
Right. It is. So I mean, do I have, in other words, like one tradition that stands as the ultimate authority in moments of philosophical lack of clarity or ethical conundrums or whatever it might be?
Yeah, exactly.
That's a great question. Non-dual philosophy, which we find in both the Buddhist and the Hindu traditions, I think they come into so much fundamental alignment that philosophically there's rarely a conflict across the traditions. But within the traditions, I do take the logic of non-dualism as superior to the logic of dualism. And so whether from a Buddhist or a Hindu perspective, in conversations and debates I've ever had with people, I don't ever hesitate to resort to those traditions on whatever issue is being discussed, right? Whether it's practice or anything else. And as far as ethics go, however, I also think it's really, Muktananda used to say, yes, worship the guru because the guru is the self and the self is God, but ultimately you are the self, right? Mm-hmm. And there has to be that point where you really come to trust yourself in terms of what is wrong and right and what it is that must be done. And, and I think we get in that conversation, it becomes in part intuition, right? And just trusting that, this or that is wrong, because there are circumstances in our life where, you can't necessarily go to the Tantra Loka 3.24 to decipher whether or not God is telling you to vote for Hillary or Trump. That's just whatever. Or, another, and we can talk about politics if you like, but, another example might be, I think a simple one would be, okay, animal sacrifices. A lot of Hindus endorse animal sacrifice. I have very mixed feelings about that, right. So the taking of a life, etc. So then, in that context, maybe you could say, well, a kind of Buddhist nonviolent logic kicks in. So,
So there's a kind of pragmatic domain to this.
Yeah. Right. Where I really think, and I do think, Abhinavagupta, that tradition is basically saying, like, this is a training about, you coming to recognize that your body is the house for consciousness, right? And there's only one consciousness spread throughout all of the cosmos, and that consciousness, it's ever present, it's all knowing, and coming to trust that consciousness is what's speaking through you, that's how you come to know.
Right. That's great.
But I'd also say that I think ethically, Tantra gets a hard rap, but, ethically, certainly in Muktananda's interpretation of Tantra, generally, Tantric ethics is really actually grounded fundamentally in the wisdom of nonviolence and compassion, particularly that's strong in Buddhist traditions with the whole bodhisattva ideal, right? That your salvation is contingent on the salvation of all living beings.
Yeah. So to get back for a minute to the traditions in Nepal that you explore in your book, I was thinking while I was reading it, wow, this is such a beautiful tradition, and I imagine those that read the book who are practitioners would maybe feel very inspired to kind of study those traditions. But then there's this sensitivity to the fact that the tradition seems to be very much integrated with a particular geography. In fact, that's part of what your book's about. Is the kind of the geographical contingency of this Sarvamnaya tradition and the various geographical points and temples and cities that are related to it. And of course, there is an esoteric dimension. But is there anything, first of all, can someone who is from outside Nepal can a non-Nepalese person move to Nepal and take initiation into these traditions without, is there anything inherently problematic with that? And then the second question besides that would be, does it make sense to, especially when we talk about in a moment, the historical political forces that are leading to the degradation or the kind of end of the centrality of these traditions in Nepal, does it make sense for this tradition to leave Nepal? Like, can it leave Nepal given how geographically connected it is?
Yeah. Those are very deep questions. And of course, obviously, you get people real fired up about
Sure.
the hot topic, cultural appropriation.
Yeah, yeah.
So, I can offer my opinion. And it's kind of, obviously, I operate a lot through both and then kind of middle ground logic. So
that's great.
I really respect the cultural appropriation argument. But the other side of that is the fact that traditions are constantly in flux.
Right.
There's no tradition. Traditions like Trikakal and Sarvamaya come into being because they transmigrate.
Yeah.
Right? And someone from somewhere else appropriates them and puts them together with something else. And this is how wisdom, knowledge, cultures expand. So as far as Westerners going to Nepal and receiving initiation, I did it, right? And I think in part Stanishwar and others looked at me and said, well, you're kind of a cultural freak. Basically, some even said, well, you must be your last incarnation must have been in Nepal, so you're just coming back, right? Yeah. So
you're just chilling, yeah.
Our tradition surrounded you, so here you are, fine, no big deal. I think it's case by case how much information folks are going to want to give up. But also what happens in so many cultures, as it did in Tibet, so in Nepal, the world comes to Nepal, Nepal goes to the world, all sorts of cultural forces come into play. You get someone like Stanishwar Timosina, who's really, I identify him in my book as a modern day Abhinavagupta, and I think that's fair in terms of his scholarly breadth.
Wow.
And, part of what makes Stanishwar so amazing is he didn't just master the Vedas when he was young, and then Vedanta and yoga and Samkhya and Vaisheshika and just go on and do all of this stuff, so that by the time he was 22, he was already being given his own tantric department at the Valmiki College of Sanskrit,
wow.
Right? He was hanging out with David Gordon White and all sorts of outstanding Western and European scholars and learning from them and wanting to study Western philosophy and master English. And now, as a 50-year-old man, he really lives in all of these worlds. And absolutely, he's never lost his connection to his Sarvamaya tradition, and he's tirelessly sharing everything that he can. Mm-hmm. And it really takes just one person like Stanishwar, a Muktananda, or a Dalai Lama to say, you know what, these are secret traditions. I know there was a good reason for that. Times have changed. We're throwing these doors open.
Mm.
Now, it is true that these traditions get very much grounded in local geographies, languages, cultures. And so what I think has to happen, and this is why I recommended to you Stanishwar's Tantric visual culture, is because what he's trying to do through that is offer the Tantric code, kind of the Ur code, for thinking about these place-based traditions and understanding how you can take the logic of that grounding in a legitimate way and then reapply that logic to the place that you are.
Mm.
And that's brilliant. And I think there's a lot of work that can be done with that, right?
Yeah.
And so I think both are somewhat legitimate. I think if you're going to go to Nepal and get initiated, you do really have to throw yourself into that local culture. And I can't really see how long it takes. It takes a while, right? You got to language.
Well, that was another thing I was sort of interested in, with the 6 streams. Like, how long does it take to get initiated into each one of those?
Yeah. Well,
long time, right?
I got fast tracked in the course. Lucky
you, man.
So Stanishwar, by the end of a year, had done all of them.
Whoa.
You know, and I don't know if I don't know how to say how legitimate. I mean, I think ideally it would have happened in a more classical way over a much longer duration. I would have had time to do each of the initiations. But he did it, you know, and he did it in part because I was writing the book, and I think in part because he felt like, well, there's also a level where this, you know, this is a system that's coming together. It's working. It has a result that even kind of transcends your own perspective on whether or not it's doing anything.
Yeah.
So answers, I think, are going to vary on that.
Yeah.
But, you know, I think Stanishwar's answer to it is a very interesting one. I've heard other people like him say, you know, we have to adapt to the times. And knowledge, consciousness is speeding up. You know, the advancement of technology all over the world, you know, Tantra is a technology. And so that technology, it's speeding up. The speed with which it can be handed off. And also, you know, and I think folks like Douglas Brooks and others have said this, you know, it needs to be transmitted.
Right.
Right. Because you know, here comes that faith perspective. This is a wisdom that, if imparted, enlightens people to learn so that they can live in the places that they habitate in ways that are conducive to the people and places there.
Yeah. Yeah. So Stanishwar, you've mentioned him as kind of a master. Does he also initiate in these traditions, or is he a scholar mainly?
No, I mean he initiated me. He is a scholar practitioner. Before I met him, he was, you know, very strongly identified already. By the time I met him, as both a preeminent lineage holder for Sarvamnaya Shakta Tantra, and then also a scholar who was the head of his own department of Tantra. And going forward from there, he went through a period where I think he was really focused on proving to the West that he could be a Western scholar. And he went to Germany and got a second PhD there, and went to Santa Barbara for a while, and then he got his position, and now he's full professor, and he's published so much stuff, and he's just so widely respected. And I think now, as it were, having climbed to the summit of the scholarly mountain, I think he's up there looking around going, and you know what, like my deepest self, the part of my life that I've always loved the most is my life of devotion and relationship to the goddess, and I'm going to be that person, and I am a scholar.
That's beautiful.
And so now he's giving workshops, and for people who are genuinely interested, he will give this knowledge.
That's excellent. So where can people find him? I'm just curious, since we're talking so much about him.
Yeah, well, he's not hidden. I mean, if you go to San Diego State University, Google search field his name, you'll find him. He's on Facebook. I think if you Google him, you'll find, you know, he's on academia.edu. Certainly, if you sent him an email to his San Diego State University, or friend him on Facebook and just say, hey, you know, I just did this podcast with Jeffrey, and, you know, been reading his book. I'd love to interview you too. I'm sure he'd be happy to do that and talk further. I mean, he's just, I think for a lot of it, you know, I was thinking about this podcast. It's the first podcast I've ever done, and you know, you get so immersed into your scholarship, and it really ultimately is a fairly small world of people who share this interest with you. You know, I mean, there's an overlap with practitioners, but the practitioners who like really want to know, like, well, what is the Sri Yantra all about? Those are few and far between. So I think myself and certainly Stanishwar, anyone who has that genuine interest, it's like, yeah, let's hang out.
Yeah, no, and they are few and far between, but I think that collectively there are actually quite a large number, which is why it's important, I think, to build that community online of people that are interested in it, because it's a minority, but it's a large minority at the end of the day. So
yes, and
go
folks
ahead.
like, you know, Paul Muller and Douglas Brooks and Harish Wallace, they're connected to that, you know, and in a really rich way, and connecting with that community. I think long story short, I think he'd appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely interested in doing that. Okay, so let's talk about a couple more things before we wrap up our conversation. One of them is the history of antinomian practices within the tantric tradition. Obviously, I won't say obviously because maybe some aren't familiar, but the tantric tradition has a history of practices that are sort of unsavory to the contemporary practitioner, the exchange of bodily fluids, ritualized sex, and historically this took sort of a turn with Abhinavagupta, as you mentioned in your book, into a more kind of esoteric, symbolic domain. And of course, I study with Paul, and that's sort of the way that it's always described. I mean, these are sort of symbolic things. So, I think this is very interesting. Like, what is the antinomian aspect of Tantra missing now that it's become sort of, symbolically registered? Or what is the role of antinomianism in the practice of Tantra?
Yeah, very good. So it's like all of these historical layers get systematized by someone like Abhinavagupta, but they don't go away.
Right?
And they still exist to today. I mean, you go to Benares and you can find the Agora Babas, still going to the cremation grounds.
Right.
These claims to eat feces and, doing all this radical stuff.
Yeah.
So it is still there. It's a minority practice, but it does still exist. And I think, what was the purpose of it and what still is, at least within the context of non-dual tantric systems, which really, I think, are dominant certainly today. They're the most popular forms of Tantra. The logic of antinomian practices is pretty clear. It's about saying, well, okay, reality, at least socially constructed reality, is predicated on all these dualities, right and wrong, man and woman, death and life, right, that assume opposites.
Yeah.
But ultimately, the truth is that there is a non-dual reality containing within and beyond these dualities. Then it can at least be a very powerfully transformative moment to engage in that which you ought not to engage in.
Yeah.
As a direct encounter with that consciousness which transcends these rules that create a socially constructed, reality. So I think, that the logic of that is still at play, even as Tantra kind of, through Abhinavagupta and others, sheds the necessity to do really outrageous things. And it's really I think it's a careful line to be walked. And I think as you look at a lot of guru traditions, you see the danger of this kind of logic in, the very common reality of the inevitable, not always, but often sexual scandal.
Yeah.
That we see in many guru traditions. And so obviously, there's a real need to be careful with playing with ethical systems.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because I know of one where, the sexual scandal then was sort of defended or justified as being sort of a, from the insider's perspective, they were tantric practices that, were at the end of kind of like initiatory gateways, blah, blah, blah. But then, and this might move us into the question of power dynamics, but then, from an external vantage point, it just looks like an abuse of power. And
right.
so I guess it's interesting. It's an interesting kind of dynamic. And so, and when you were saying the antinomian, it does seem to be that, in order to really experience that non-duality, you would need to kind of challenge your own presuppositions about reality, your own presupposed kind of, feelings of disgust over certain things. And so are we losing, modern, more symbolic non-dual practitioners, are we losing that radical experience of the non-dual by not entertaining these kinds of radical acts?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think one of the beauties is of the Abhinavaguptian system, right? Tantra, as formulated by Abhinavagupta, otherwise Trikakala or Kalatrika Tantra, is that he really takes the focus of the tradition to what he sees as his apex, which is a cognitive act of self-recognition, right? Pratyabhijna. And once you make that turn, then all sorts of things become possible cognitively, emotionally, experientially. And I think it's up to each, I think, practitioner in their own practice and in relationship with the teacher they trust who's guiding them, whether that's themselves or someone else, to explore for him or herself how it is that they are going to catapult their consciousness into this higher state of awareness. Maybe just one simple example. I never was homophobic, but let's say I was raised in a home, maybe here in the South, perhaps on a farm, where it was just ingrained in me to be homophobic.
Mm-hmm.
So that would set up for me then, right, this ingrained consciousness of something as being wrong. And maybe later in my life I came to encounter Tantra, and in the context of Tantra, in my own meditative experiences and perhaps experiences with other people in my life, I started to recognize that here I was trying to understand that one singular divine consciousness pulsates in all beings, and yet I was looking to one group of people and their sexual behavior as being okay and good, and I was judging another, right, and seeing them in a kind of negative way. And so maybe then for me, that kind of antinomianism would be my own process of deconstructing a very deeply ingrained bias through a kind of exercise in which that negative other, I transcended that concept. It became a good, which is not to say that it might also be the case. And, it's so hard for me to say what anyone, maybe you're a vegetarian. This happened for me. I was vegetarian. I became a meat eater for a period. Sexual ethics becomes more complex. Of course, sexual practice is a part of tantric practice. It's not a mandatory part. It's present within it. It's logical that it's there because the tradition is about the uniting of male and female and all the various registers of that, and it's about the body. And so obviously sexual union is going to be a part of that, both as symbol and as practice. So I think the options are still there for people to experience that kind of antinomian transcendence. I do not think it's mandatory to go meditate on corpses and eat feast and do all that stuff.
Well, what you're sort of pointing to that I think is really interesting is that, what you're sort of inviting us to think about is kind of what contextually makes sense as an antinomian practice in the modern, era. And one of our biggest social phenomena that we all struggle with, I think, at every perspective, whether you consider yourself liberal or conservative, is the idea of the negative other that you're talking about, which of course ultimately is in oneself and then manifests as, homosexuals or trans people or people of a particular ethnicity. So maybe that is, and then, going back to eating feces or eating meat, like these were materials that, were actually, very much socially, there was a whole, ideology around not eating meat and blah, blah, blah. So it would make sense that within that context, the antinomianism would kind of circulate around those particular things when if we, take ourselves now into our kind of contemporary context, the antinomian really is this, what do we see continuously percolating up into our experiences with one another? What are the arguments on Facebook always about? They're about this vilification of other people, and so it's so I love that. I actually really love that idea of allowing the antinomianism of tantric practice really to confront that negative other that really does shape and create our own, dialogue and discourse with each other.
Yeah, that's very well put. And what you said, reminds us all that Tantra arises in a world that included, if it was not dominated by traditional Brahmanic Vedic society and culture, right, which was heavily hierarchical and grounded in codes of purity. And so the logic of Tantra was in no small part about reclaiming power within a system that could very easily disempower individuals, right? Lower caste, non-accepted genders, whatever it might be. And so I think that's another way to think about the message of power the message of Tantra and how you relocate it into the place that you are, right? It's a system of logic about empowering oneself in all the senses of the word, and they're different. The Tantra has systems of thought that are more negative, like we could say dark sorcery. But I think, the higher Tantra, I think what Trikakala is about, especially as someone like Muktananda taught it, and what, the Dalai Lama's Tantric Buddhism is all about, is really kind of recognizing the fundamental dignity, not just of oneself and all human beings, but all of life, right? And so I think higher Tantra should result in the perspective that we should hold in the highest regard all beings, and we should act in such a way.
Yeah, beautiful.
So I think to translate that into our contemporary social political environment, I think it's a very important task.
Yeah, me too. Wow. So one more question, because I really do want to get to this before we close, and because I was, thinking about this a lot, and it kind of connects with my own history as well, which is the question of power. And in your book, you straddle the kind of post-structuralist critique of power relations, or I don't know if I would say straddle, but you at least entertain, these critiques in your exploration, and that critique, and then the theological perspective, which of course, looks to the liberating character of these traditions, whereas the post-structuralist critic would only be able to see the kind of binding nature of these traditions and how they are just, different articulations of power, blah, blah, blah. So what is the, in your own consideration, you seem not to make a choice between the two. You seem to kind of entertain, the critiques of the post-structuralists so far as they go, in the sense that, especially in the conversation around Kumari, who's a 5-year-old girl that's been kind of sort of ushered in as this stand-in for this goddess Kumari, and so there's the kind of level, there's a power dynamic at play that's sort of instantiating and legitimizing a certain political system, but then there's also the theological character of it. So can you just talk a little bit about that, and sort of what the role is of these two different lenses, and how they sit with you as a scholar practitioner?
Yeah, so that interpretive lens is really my effort to take the emic or insider's internal theological logic of the system and really to take it seriously. Yeah. Because the logic of the system is grounded in much older traditions. You see both the Buddhist Nagarjuna and then also the Hindu Shankaracharya, both using a two truths logic in which they're assuming a distinction between a constructed reality and a transcendent reality. And so I wanted to understand how those two could interplay within this tradition, and I wanted to take seriously what seemed to be the case, which is that the authors of the texts I was reading were assuming they were living in a world that took seriously a theological position that there is some divine transcendent being that creates all this and is the source of all of this. And at the same time, let's not kid ourselves. We're human beings. We're creating these rituals and these ideas, and we're using language, and it's connected to a network of practices and institutions. Mm-hmm. It's all going on at the same time. So they're operating from the assumption that one doesn't remove the presence of the other.
Right.
Right? But how can they then work together? And at what points do they come into contradiction? And basically what I was trying to get at is, sure, I mean, the kind of materialist, Marxist, later Foucauldian idea that human beings are creating their knowledge systems and those are embedded in institutions, and all of that becomes inseparably linked to hierarchical structures of power, that's always at play. Yes, but could it not also be the case that the very capacity of human beings to kind of bind themselves is in fact a reflection of some kind of transcendent power that's nonetheless operative even in the moment of the binding? And obviously you have to be aware of how any kind of reference to a transcendent can be just used as justification for the logic and authenticity of the system, right? Mm-hmm. But I did want to take seriously that this is what these Nepali authors were suggesting, and it's really not to say that never challenge the system, never fight oppression. I don't think that's at all what they're saying,
right?
And also, as I kind of suggested earlier, this argument that I was trying to make, like take the insider's logic of the tradition, take it seriously, but then think about it critically and bring it up with other systems of knowledge, reflected a kind of balancing that I was trying to create within myself as someone who spent about 10 years being a somewhat naive Bhakta devotee, and then being kind of deconstructed and falling for a while into a really kind of hypercritical, post-structuralist, even atheist kind of perspective, and then kind of bringing it back and seeing, well, within the logic of non-dualism, at what point does a theist and an atheist even meet? Right? Someone who's totally grounded in this is a human reality, someone grounded in this is a God reality. Well, from the logic of Tantra, how do you distinguish between a God and a human reality?
Yeah. So how do you get the atheists to agree with that?
Well, there is tradition of philosophy in the West, material non-dualism.
Really?
And so from that kind of perspective, so because the understanding of atheism that I appreciate the most is one that was used by Roman pagans against Christians and by ancient Christians in turn against pagans, which was just a way of saying you're atheist because you reject the normative theological tradition.
Right.
Right. So you can be someone who rejects normative theological traditions and assumptions, but that doesn't mean you assume that there isn't one singular consciousness intelligence that is everywhere embedded in this cosmos, connecting at all points, right? I mean, there are scientific theories from folks like David Bohm that say that exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think in my own mind, as I started to call into question, what is the guru really? What is Shiva really? I found that I never lost sight of that. Somehow I could never reject the idea of intelligence, of consciousness, of experience. And so in that context, I just came, well, okay, so if I talk about God, to use that language, I'm automatically in the realm of dualism, at least potentially show.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So
because the name of God invokes something external to you?
Exactly.
Okay.
It can, right? It can be redefined, but yeah, it can. And so then atheism is kind of of course, it rejects that, but it doesn't have to reject the idea that it's all consciousness, which, of course, is what Trikakala was teaching. And therein, I realized, like, it's just labels, right? Label me a theist, label me an atheist. I'm still a conscious being. And I believe that the consciousness that I am experiencing, I believe that consciousness is everywhere present in the cosmos. And obviously that becomes faith, right? I mean, scientists can suggest to us that it's right and here's why, but I can't possibly know for sure that my consciousness is everywhere present in the cosmos. But I do believe that it is, that not Jeffrey's consciousness, but that I'm sharing that consciousness.
Yeah, you're participating in that absolute consciousness. Yeah. Wow. Well, that's a beautiful note to end on, the note of absolute consciousness being everywhere. So, before we close things down, if you want to share a little bit about I don't know if you're doing any workshops or if you have any presentations that you're doing that are coming up that people who are listening to the podcast might want to tune into or look you up, or if you have a website you want to share, anything like that.
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much. So, I'm the chair of the Department of Religion and Philosophy at Berry, and that's really what grounds my work. And I'm raising a 3-year-old, so my summer is devoted a lot to that. But
that's a handful.
It's a handful, but I definitely invite listeners to my academia page, academia.edu. Jeffrey S. Lidke, you'll find me. Just about everything I've published is up there. And then my book, which we've talked about, maybe I can send you the link to that. That is available for purchase. So I would definitely invite folks to that. And, if folks have heard things that they'd like to talk further about, please reach out via email or Facebook, academia, and I'd be happy to start conversations. If someone, for example, is listening from a yoga center, is like, oh, well, that might be nice if you came and talked about that. I'm definitely open and I've done those things. I'm not actively currently engaged in, doing that, but I enjoy doing that.
Excellent. All right. Well, I'm sure there will be some opportunities that come up from this. We've had a lot of that happen. So thank you so much for talking to me, Jeffrey. It's been a real pleasure. And I will look forward to speaking with you soon.
Wonderful. Thank you. The pleasure has been mine.
All right.